Hi, Steve. It's great to have you on the show. How was your trip to the UK? Did you have fun?
Yes, it was a blast. I've only been to London one time before. I've only been to the UK once before, and that was a long time ago. So it was nice to reconnect, and had a lot of chips and some fish.
Cool. So, Appetite for Self-Destruction. It's a pretty strong title. Would you like to start by explaining how you came up with the idea for this book?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit of an indirect answer. I was actually approached by an agent who had read an article that I'd written in Wired magazine, asking if I had any ideas for a book, and I sent him 10 ideas, and the one that he liked was about the entire history of the music industry. So going back to Thomas Edison in the late 1800s. and that would be not just the record industry, but also concerts and radio and all the different things. That turned out to be a bit broad, and when we pitched it around to a variety of publishers, that was sort of their reaction. They liked the pitch, but they wanted it narrowed down, and there was this dramatic moment when I was supposed to do an interview with the publishers at Free Press, and they wanted me to come up with a narrowed down idea that worked in about 2 hours. Yeah. And so when I kind of panicked, and I called a great source who I work with for my work at Rolling Stone, and he came up with the idea, Eric Garland of Big Champagne, he came up with the idea of digital music. If you start with the adoption of the CD and you go all the way through Napster and iTunes and then to the present day, then you have sort of a built-in dramatic arc. And that it clicked, everything clicked from there, and they liked the pitch and went with it.
Oh, cool. Yeah, sounds like it was a off-the-cuff idea that kind of turned out to be a fantastic one, actually, in the end. And the first half of the book is so fascinating in describing the state of the record industry, even throughout the 80s and 90s, because some of the stuff is not quite what people that are born, after the 1980s have come to know. In particular, I was enthralled by the story of the DAT. Its development and ultimate failure is a great example of how the industry has been preoccupied with the possibility of digital piracy from very early on. Can you talk briefly about what you think killed the DAT and why the labels were so against this format?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, before the internet, the thinking among the record industry and the major labels and the very powerful people who ran them was that piracy and bootlegging was a huge threat. It was the enemy number one of the record industry and the number one threat to its profits. So they were constantly on the prowl, on the defensive, and trying to defend themselves from these very legitimate. This threat was a legitimate threat. There were bootleggers all over the world who were counterfeiting music, and this was a big problem. But their paranoia went too far, and they started to interpret technology advances that could have been very good for the industry purely as threats in the context of this counterfeiting and piracy. And so this had gone back all the way to really the home taping industry. The record industry was really not a fan of cassette tapes, blank cassette tapes, going way back to the 70s. And so when Sony unveiled, first of all, this was part of the thing that explained the resistance to compact discs, which I explained in the book. Compact discs were a perfect format that you could tape over and over and over again, and the sound would be just as good, unlike LPs. So that was perceived as a threat. And then when the DAT came out, that was a way the record industry really did not like the record button on the DAT, and they felt that the double whammy of being able to have pristine copies of a record on a CD and make pristine endless copies and copies of the copies and so forth on the DAT, that would have been a big problem. So in a variety of ways, the industry, and I believe this was the late 80s, early 90s, just set out to stamp out the DAT any way they could. And they were ultimately successful, and the format really never caught on as a consumer format, although professionals, musicians, producers used it for years and are still doing it to an extent.
But that's a really interesting point, that the labels were really worried about formats that were coming from legitimate sources and formats that they could actually license. And this is probably what threw them when the MP3 came, because the MP3 was a format that the labels did not choose, did not sanction, and it was developed very cheaply for a young audience, and it had no multinational corporation behind it. So for the first time, they had a medium that they had no control of. Do you think this was the main reason that caused the prolonged hostility towards digital distribution and digital media in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. They were the labels historically were obsessed with piracy, going back a long ways, and part of this was, the question that you asked about the threat from MP3s and Napster and so forth has sort of two answers. The one is that yes, part of the resistance to new technology and MP3s and Napster and the great innovation and opportunity that it spoke to was because of paranoia and because of control. And the labels for decades controlled their entire industry. They had their thumb on the retailers. They had their thumb on radio. They controlled that in a way through payola for many, many years. Yeah. And on media, press, by giving out free CDs and all these different things. So when some new technology came along, it was perceived as a threat to this control. It was even perceived as a threat when Sony and Philips, which owned a couple of these record companies or had partnerships with them, were coming in with the new CD. But it was especially a threat. It was like a declaration of war when it came from this 19-year-old kid, Sean Fanning, and his crazy uncle. But the second thing is that even we can sort of be smug and say, the industry made these huge mistakes, and I certainly detail them in my book. But I also think that there was a legitimate response too. I mean, I'm not someone who defends piracy, and I do think while the obsession with piracy was a bit much, I do think that Napster, my personal opinion is that Napster and MP3s and that sort of file sharing and trading, I do think there was a copyright infringement involved, and courts have sort of borne that out. And I do think it was fair for the industry to an extent to react with lawsuits in the way that it did.
Yeah, a lot of people actually believe that there was a moment in time when major labels executives actually sat in a room with Sean Fanning from Napster and had the chance to buy the service to make it legitimate. Do you think that is true? Have you done any research into that? Because I've heard this rumor flying around, but I haven't heard any confirmation of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the labels, I don't know the exact meeting that you're talking about with Sean Fanning himself, but I do detail in one of my chapters, in my Napster chapter, another series of meetings, and one meeting in particular in 2000 when the CEO of Napster at the time, Hank Berry, and other people from the Hummer Winblad venture capital firm that was financing Napster at the time, met with the top executives of the record industry, including Edgar Bronfman from Universal, and I forget his first name, but Mr. Ade from Sony, and Thomas Middelhoff from Bertelsmann, and tried to persuade these labels to make a deal. And I sort of positioned that meeting as kind of the high stakes meeting, the crossroads meeting, whatever you want to call it, as this was the moment that they could have made a deal and chose not to, for a variety of reasons. I mean, part of it was stubbornness on Napster's side as well.
Yeah. Well, the industry ended up kind of shooting itself in the foot because they set up fairly early on the Secure Digital Music Initiative, and you talk about this in the book, that ran between 1998 and 2002. But that kind of fizzled out with no real agreement in place, giving Apple the chance they needed to create a platform and a format that was proprietary and that could not be shared with other companies. Why was it so hard for the industry to come up with an agreement on the digital formats?
Well, you identify that period, 1998 to 2002, and I do in my book as well, correctly as a very crucial period. And that period was when the labels had the opportunity to say, we're going to come up with something new. They didn't have to actually invent it themselves necessarily, but there were many, many digital companies, new companies from, Liquid Audio all the way to Napster, depending on their legitimacy and so forth, that wanted to make these deals with the labels, Real and Rhapsody and so forth. And the labels just chose to stonewall because, to use a well-worn cliche from that period, I really believe that the executives of the record labels at the time really felt that they could put the genie back into the bottle. They really felt like all we have to do is sue this stuff, sue Napster, sue Kazaa, sue LimeWire, eventually sue their own customers, and all this MP3 and file sharing and piracy will just go away. Yeah. And so therefore they still felt at that time these big characters, these powerful guys like Tommy Mottola, Clive Davis, Doug Morris, they still kind of felt like they were in control, and the old business model would eventually just come back, and it would never go away. It had been making them rich for many, many decades, especially in the CD era, and they just felt like, why should we bother with this new model? It'll go away, and we'll keep going. And that turned out, of course, not to be true, and of course, turned out to be their downfall.
Yeah. Well, you recently interviewed Daniel Elk from the digital music startup Spotify. Do you think that his model could be the future for the music industry? And if not, what do you foresee as being the next big thing in digital music?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot, and I think his model is a very compelling one. Just to explain it, as you know, Spotify is a free streaming music service, so it's sort of like the ultimate radio station, and it's ad supported, which means that in order to get all this music for free, you can't own it, but you just rent it whenever you want on your computer, perhaps eventually on a mobile device, although they haven't done that yet. All you have to do is listen to a few ads here and there. And the ads, the pool of money from the ads is shared with the record labels, although we don't know exactly how those deals are created. So to answer your other question, I don't know. I think Spotify is very compelling. It's very successful in Europe, and it does seem to be something that's effective and could be a great revenue source for the labels. I feel positively about it. But I don't know if there's one sort of magic bullet high-tech solution that will do the thing that labels have always wanted, which is, destroy all the piracy, allow them to go back to business again, and make all the money that they made in the 80s and 90s. I really think that it's less sort of like we just have to find the new iTunes or the new whatever the CD is in the digital world, and then everything will be fine. I really think that the philosophy has to be different.
Yeah.
And one thing that strikes me as a very new, compelling, not new, but I mean, it's been around forever. But to me, there's something in the model of giving away something for free and then selling something more expensive that makes you more money later. And the Radiohead model, I think, spoke to that. Radiohead was willing to give away its music, although people wound up paying a lot of money for it. And in the end, that marketing and publicity and band loyalty wound up generating a lot of money for Radiohead in the form of more expensive concert tickets and more expensive deluxe CD packages that people bought in the stores. And there's a lot of that going around. Bruce Springsteen gave away MP3s earlier this year, and then embarked on a successful concert tour that was very expensive. And I see that kind of thing continuing. I see that creative bands, creative labels, creative managers, we just saw No Doubt give away its entire recorded catalog as in the form of online downloads with the price of a concert ticket. These kinds of ideas strike me as really interesting and really good, and there's a whole lot of unexplored terrain, a lot of experimenting that can be done in that area. And unfortunately, it doesn't really favor the record label's business model because they don't own all those concert rights and merchandise rights and the rights for the more expensive products. Unfortunately, they're left holding what is now sort of the free product. So I'm not totally optimistic about the label's future, but I am optimistic about the music business future, and I think that eventually all this stuff will get sorted out.
Yeah, I think everybody hopefully agrees on that point, that the music is not dying out, but it's just the role of the labels that is changing continuously in the last few years. In Appetite for Self-Destruction, you must have interviewed loads of people to get all the information that is contained in the book. What was the most interesting interview you had, or what was the most kind of unbelievable experience, I guess, that you had while doing the interview?
Oh, man, unbelievable experience. It's hard to say. I interviewed, I think, 230 people. Yeah. There were some people that I really, really enjoyed interviewing. Roger Ames, who was an official at Warner at the time and was one of the biggest proponents of iTunes early on, and is now with EMI, was very erudite and very supportive and very kind. Joe Smith, who was for many decades a top executive at Warner, and in fact, discovered artists like the Grateful Dead in the '60s and Garth Brooks in the '80s. He has a reputation for being sort of a raconteur in the music industry, and just had me in stitches. He just everything he said had me laughing out loud, and I was really pleased to talk to him because he helped inject a note of humor in my book that I really was pleased with. I was really happy that I could make some of this kind of long-winded, murky topic a little bit funny and light and entertaining, and he certainly helped me do that. So those two in particular were really fun to interview.
Yeah, because there's always a sort of an underlying irony in the book that I really enjoyed, and while it was completely factual, it still had a kind of an underlying sort of irony, almost bordering on sarcasm at a point that was really entertaining. It made it a really readable book.
Well, thank you for noticing that. I appreciate that. That's what I was going for sure.
I don't want to keep you too long, so I just wanted to ask you a last question. In the book, you make a note of a few mistakes that the industry committed, let's say, during its last 25 to 30 years of history. I was wondering, do you think there is an underlying original sin for the music industry? Is there one mistake that was particularly damaging for them? Or do you think all of the mistakes that they committed are consequential to one another?
That's a really good question. And yes, I think that the mistakes that I talk about, which, as you know, they go from the beginning. The first one was sort of the CD long box, which was this unrecyclable cardboard box that housed the CD in order to fit in record store racks.
Yeah.
All the way up to Sony and BMG and the rootkit and the near viruses that they infected people's computers with when they were trying to protect the CD. So I think that I'm not sure any one of those constitutes something as large as original sin, but I think that they all add up to a theme, which is that which is sort of the theme of the book, really, which is that the record industry has long historically been suspicious of new technology, and that goes. I start with the adoption of the CD, and it was true in that era, but it goes all the way back to radio. Nobody wanted to give away their songs on the radio. Nobody wanted to give away the songs on MTV. Even back to sheet music. Everybody was super happy selling and making money off sheet music in the early 1900s. And when recorded music came along, the record industry was, or what you called the music industry back then, I guess, was very suspicious of it. And so I think that underlying sort of reluctance to plunge into anything with new technology, all of those, or most of those big mistakes, speak to that. And I really think that the Napster MP3 internet thing was kind of the final revenge of technology on the record industry for being so suspicious and so sort of backwards on that point for so many decades.
Well, that sounds like a good way to wrap it up. And the book is fantastic, and I could have kept talking about it for hours. It's going on sale in the UK today, and it's already available in the US. It's received great reviews from the New York Times and the LA Times, and it's by far the best summary I've come across on the music industry's hits and misses of the last 30 years, especially in the US. Is there any way that people can follow your work further, people that are listening to the podcast?
Yeah, I do have a website. It's called Knopps, KNOPPS.com. And I'm not great about the updates, but I try. So, yeah. But you can definitely find out what I'm up to and what I've been writing on there. My current work runs pretty much every issue of Rolling Stone, where I continue to cover the music business and particularly the concert business at the moment.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much to take the time to come on the show. It was an honor, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you very much. I appreciate